friend and colleague of mine a few months ago was saying that she didn't really know what was in the Bible, or if she was going to look inside one, she wouldn't know where to start or find things. So I thought I'd do a couple of short videos on the basic layout of the Bible. The first thing to mention is that the Bible is made up of lots of different books. And if you open somewhere towards the front of a Bible, you're going to have a contents page. And it's going to tell you which page number to find the start of each book anyway, so it's not like you have to know it all off by heart, what books were. I'm quite a dweeb, and I was sat in a theology lecture a few years ago, and goodness knows why, but if I'm concentrating, sometimes I doodle or I just fiddle with stuff in front of me. And for some reason, I was just putting a finger in the start page of each of these separate books, and got to the stage that I ran out of fingers. But I realised that the sections of pages in between each finger was about the same length. And then it hit me that this must be sort of maximum scroll length, which leads me to the point that the Bible isn't really, it's a collection of various manuscripts that have been later on sewn together, bound together, and that is important to remember, that it's not one book that was all written on one date at all. It's been parts of it have been written in lots of different centuries, and it's all been brought together because Christians believe that it all should be read in light of how it all fits together. So the Bible is divided into two main sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And these two sections they're not the same length at all. I'm just trying to find the divide. Here we are. The Old Testament, this is the Old Testament I'm holding up. As you can see, it's a bit beefy. And the New Testament, in comparison, is a bit skinny. So if you're looking for the New Testament, you'll find it right towards the end of the Bible. The Old Testament is what Christians read in common with Jews. It's basically the Hebrew scriptures, the sacred scriptures of the Jewish people, and it's the same scriptures that Jesus himself and the earliest Christians would have read and considered as their Bible. The New Testament is those books in the Bible that are specifically about Jesus and the earliest Christians. For now, I'll give you a brief overview of the Old Testament, and then I'll do a second short clip and say what's where in the New Testament. So the Old Testament is there's probably about two or three main types of book in there. There's books that a lot of it is recording the story of the early Israelites, or the Hebrew people, or the early Jews. So a lot of it is telling the story of their history, telling stories of famous leaders they had and famous prophets, and recording the laws that God gave to them. In particular, the first two books of the Old Testament, Genesis and Exodus, they've got a lot of the stories that you've probably heard, that you're probably quite familiar with. Genesis starts with the story of creation, then the story of Adam and Eve, then Noah and the flood, then slightly later on you've got Joseph. You might have seen the musical, Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Those famous stories are in Genesis, and Exodus is mainly the story of Moses and him leading the Israelites out of Egypt and the giving of the Ten Commandments. After that, the next few books. Is my phone going off? The next few books are concentrate on those rules that God gave to His chosen nation. After that, you've got a lot of books that are just describing, like I said, the history of this nation, of the Israelites, which includes stories of some of their leaders and stories of some of the prophets that God sent them to try and bring them back to living under the rules that He'd given them, and to not just concentrate on the external sides of their religion, but to properly revere God in their hearts and properly treat the vulnerable people in society that were being oppressed. They're the main two styles of book in the Old Testament. A couple of other things that I'll mention. There's the book of Job, which is the story of a man who was faithful to God but went through a lot of suffering, and it's a book that a lot of people refer to when they're thinking about the question of why do bad things happen to good people. So it's quite famous for that book. Proverbs is a book of just a whole string of nuggets of wisdom, really, including some quite some cracking verses. Things like a nagging wife is like a dripping tap, and it's quite fun to read actually. But it's got a lot of profound things to say about life in there as well. And the last book I was going to mention in the Old Testament, which you've probably heard of, is the book of Psalms, which is a book of prayers and hymns. Really, I suppose it was a bit like the Jewish hymn book or song book, and it's hymns and prayers that Jesus Himself would have used, and the early Christians would have used, and even now Christians use them in their prayers and their services. And the psalm you've probably heard of is Psalm 23, which starts, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That's my overview of the Old Testament. And look for my second part of this video, and I'll give a brief overview of the New Testament.